So the title of this lecture is we're going to talk about food safety culture. So food safety culture, I think, is the sort of next phase in food safety. Because if we think about the history of food safety, or in the modern era at least, we know in the 1980s, for example, there was numerous foodborne illness scares, which brought into play HACCP in the mid-90s as a mandatory food safety system in certain sectors. And certainly HACCP has been proven very effective at reducing foodborne illness. It certainly is the best system we have. And from HACCP, we then evolved into GFSI, which is a Global Food Safety Initiative, which essentially is based on HACCP in a way, so a food safety management system, just to ensure that when HACCP's applied, it's applied universally and to a standard, and that the HACCP plan works. So we came through this sort of period from the 80s where we had all these food scares, through the 90s where HACCP was being introduced, and then in more recent times with the GFSI, the BRC and the SQF auditing systems. And I think the next phase will be the food safety culture, because as we'll see, even though we have food safety systems like GFSI and HACCP, the reality is foodborne illness is still there. We still have numerous recalls. I would suggest that recalls are actually higher now than they certainly were a decade ago, even though foodborne illness cases are down. And so this sort of plateau we've reached in terms of avoiding recalls and avoiding foodborne illness, people have many theories about it, but it's obvious that food safety systems can only do so much. And so what we have to do then is think, how can we make things better? And as we'll see in a few examples, it's usually the people that are the weak link in the program, and it's their culture that affects the actual safety of food. So as I mentioned, I think food safety culture will be this sort of next phase, building on the sort of progress we've had with HACCP, GFSI and the like. So in terms of an outline then, I'll be talking about when food safety culture goes wrong, and a bit of the history behind food safety and whatnot. We'll be looking at the meaning of food safety culture, because food safety culture is definitely a term that's bandied about. It's certainly quoted many times by many people, but when you start drilling into the details, what does the actual name mean? What's the term of food safety culture actually mean? Certainly to some, it's just to do with training. So when we say we've got a good food safety culture, we say, well, we do training, but there's a big difference between training and behaviour, as we'll talk about. I'll certainly talk about how to implement a food safety culture system, which is not straightforward. Things like HACCP are easy because you can do risk analysis and look at critical control points, but looking at food safety culture is a bit more tricky and difficult because it's a very complex science. It's more a social science than a sort of physical science. So what we do then is we'll talk about how we measure food safety culture within a company, and because you have to know how to assess it in order to improve it. So we'll be talking about that, and we'll be talking right throughout the importance of leadership in establishing a food safety culture, because really it is the top down to the bottom, not the bottom down up to the top on this one. And we'll be talking a bit about future trends and what the future holds. So if we look at the history of civilization, we know we've gone through numerous culture changes. Certainly in the very early days where we just based hunter-gatherers, we've essentially had a culture of being nomads. We used to go from one place to another searching out for food. And as we progressed and become more civilized, we started to become farmers, usually self-sustained. Obviously, we had our odd violent period where people were trying to impose their culture on others. And once we got to about the 1700s, we had a big transition. So in the 1700s, or before the 1700s, we're really talking about food insecurity. So food insecurity is literally where you can't have a reliable food system in terms of supply, and so you get famine, you get total decimation of civilizations, And so food insecurity was a big issue, and this is why people went to wars. For example, people had riots, there was famines, if you could remember the potato famine in Ireland. And so food insecurity was before 1700, but then something happened in the 1800s, and that's the Industrial Revolution. So in the Industrial Revolution, we had this mass migration from rural areas through to urban centres. Now, to feed the population, whereas before it was literally just a case of everyone had their own farm or lived in a small village and supplied each other in a community, this is where mass food production was taking place. And with mass food production became a few issues, as we'll talk about, issues in terms of adulteration, safety. And it's interesting to note that as we entered the Industrial Revolution, our life expectancy was as much as our nomadic friends from all those about 10 or 20,000 years ago, for the simple reason that certainly it wasn't to do with just adulterated food and food safety, it was through sanitation. Obviously, disease was rife, slums, no sewage systems. But then, as we learnt more about the science of food safety in terms of microbiology and chemistry and processing, our life expectancy now has really shot up. You know, when you think about just 100 years ago, you were likely to die about the average age of 38 or something compared to what we see now. And the reason we've got this far is because of various things. Obviously, advances in medicine is the key, better nutrition, better food supply, more reliable food supply. So when we talk about our food safety system being in crisis, I think we always have to put it into perspective. Certainly, our lives are better now. I think the life expectancy is theory is to go up to 150 in the next generation. So we've certainly got a good food supply. Mainly, it's safe, but we do have instances it could be improved. And really, when we talk about improvements, we're talking about, well, you know, are food safety systems enough? Do we have to try and get the weakest link, which is the people that actually work within the food industry, to do that? So certainly, if you're looking in perspective through history, culture has had a fact, and certainly the culture in terms of food safety is much better in this modern time than it was, as I mentioned, 100 years ago. We'll go through this in fairly carefully. So when we think about food safety culture and our relation to food, obviously in the very early civilizations there was no universities, nobody could read, never mind anything else, or even afford a book, I guess. But religion was the key. All the lessons were taught through religion. And when you think about those early days in civilization, there was actually some quite advanced thinking about food safety. For example, many religions ban pork because we know pork carry parasites, because humans and pigs are fairly closely related, and the same parasites that affect them can sometimes affect us. So trichinosis is a parasite that can get into our nervous system, cause degeneration. So many religions ban that, and also this separation of meat and milk. You know, ideal prevent cross-contamination. So in the early times, it was religion that defined the culture, and include a bit of food safety. But as I said, the real big change came in civilization when we had this shift from the urban areas or the rural areas to the urban centres, the big cities, the slums, as you might want to call them. And so in the Industrial Revolution, whereas before everybody had been self-sufficient in a way, or very small communities were self-sufficient, now we had mass food production. You know, foods had to be transported thousands of miles to their destination, and really was totally open to abuse, because it's human nature to make money, to try and make as much as we can, even if that means breaking the law in some cases. So in the 1800s then, adulteration was rife. Certainly plaster of Paris to fill out flour was fairly common practice. The addition of arsenic, for example, in a perception it was going to be of benefit to it. And also an acquired taste. It's interesting that to extend coffee, for example, they put chicory in. And chicory is like obviously half, well, not even half, maybe even a tenth of the price as coffee. But the thing is, the Europeans got acquainted to chicory and coffee, and actually, you can buy when you go to Europe now. Very often, you'll find chicory and coffee together because it's an acquired taste and what they like. So, but the main sort of emphasis of adulteration was the fact that it was for profit. He was saying, well, how can we make more money from through low cost materials? And so it was open to abuse. And a lot of people say what we saw in the latter half of the 1800s was what China is today, in terms of people trying to, should we say, deceive consumers by, even if it can be lethal. If we think about the melamine in pet food, which was a few years ago, so melamine is a sort of toxic agent which is used to put into pet food to adulterate it to make it look like the protein content of the pet food is high. It's just because when you do protein analysis, you're just looking for nitrogen. So a company in China said, well, rather than using protein, which is expensive, let's put melamine in. And the melamine was added, even though they knew it was highly toxic, and the net result was hundreds, I think, if not thousands of pets suffering kidney failure due to the action of melamine. There's other sort of case with melamine. If we think about a few years ago in China, again, unfortunately, the melamine in milk issue, and even in the domestic market in China, is you've got to be very cautious about what you buy. So really, the reason why people do adulterate is because of profit, and also in some cases it's because they know nobody's looking at them. And so what was happening in the latter of the 1800s is the first regulations were brought in to do with food, and they weren't to do with food safety as such. Well, in a case of microbial safety, they're actually to do with reducing the incidence of adulteration. Basically it became against the law to adulterate foods. And that really did well to get these incidents down. And it's something to think about as we go through the presentation about what is the roles of regulations, and is the stick better than the carrot, or can people be relied upon to do the right thing just out of consciousness? But we'll talk about it as we go along. Now, modern day food adulteration is actually quite significant. We don't mean in terms of food safety hazards. Certainly adulteration today is more to do with like the horse meat scandal, where horse meat is half the price of beef. And so over in Europe, what we're doing is we're importing horse meat, some from Canada, obviously some from Europe as well. We're sending over to Romania, where it got processed, and it got returned over to Europe, other parts of Europe, where it was used to, should we say, supplement ground beef. And so what you were doing is you're paying the full price for ground beef, but actually getting horse meat. And this went on for many years, and it affected even the biggest of retailers, those retailers that are the flagships of the economy. And they were caught out, because the fact is that the people who did this saw loopholes. Nobody was watching them. They saw the retailers weren't watching them. The regulators weren't never really checked to see what meat it is. They're more focused on the sort of food safety aspects in terms of pathogens like E. coli 1957. So you had this sort of opportunity where you had loopholes in the regulations, and so essentially they exploited that. And in addition to sort of adulteration, authentication is getting very significant. So this is where people try to pass off cheap wine as vintage and other things like that. And certainly it is becoming much more significant than people actually think. There was an interesting survey I think it was over in the UK, where they were finding 50% of the wines are actually forgeries. Basically cheap wine being passed as good. But yes, another story. So again, this adulteration, though, the modern day adulteration, isn't so much a food safety issue, because even with the horse meat, it wasn't really a food safety issue as such. It was just a case of people taking advantage of a situation. And what people are talking about now is not bringing regulations in as such, but actually developing an intelligence unit. So these people would, a bit like MI5, I guess, and MI6, go round looking for gangs, looking for people doing adulteration. So an interesting sort of shift from inspection to actually criminal investigation in the food industry. But yes, adulteration was one thing, but certainly food safety is very important. So food safety really, as we talked about, it developed over time. Certainly the big sort of decade which brought everything into focus was in the 1980s. So in the 1980s, over in North America, Europe, and everywhere else, there were major outbreaks of listeria. I think in North America alone was three really big ones involving hundreds of people with listeria. In the UK there was listeria, in Europe there was. Salmonella was also very rampant, and there was an interesting story back in the 80s where the Minister of Agriculture, Edwina Curry, she was actually brave enough to come out and say that most of the eggs in the UK were contaminated with salmonella. And she lost a job for it because they said, how could you do this? Because the industry collapsed overnight. But even though she was right, the industry was very saddened the fact that she came out with it, and she lost the job with that one. And the other one is BSE. Now, the BSE really affected the UK and parts of, well, maybe France to a degree, back in the 80s. And this is where what people call mad cow disease. So this is what happened here was there was sheep with scrapie, which is the sheep version of mad cow disease, being incorporated into feed and fed to cattle. And the worry is that, yes, the cattle suffer because they get BSE, but also if it's passed through the food chain, which it was being passed through the food chain, it gets variant CJD, which is passed on to humans. So CJD is a human form, variant CJD is proposed to be through consumption of prions. Now, at this time, there was somebody called Richard Lacey who was at Leeds University, and he stood up and said BSE is a problem because it's going to run the risk of affecting thousands, if not millions of people in the population due to the risk of variant CJD. And he actually got sacked for saying that. And it's very interesting if you compare today with from just the 1980s. So in the 1980s, you put your hand up and say this is a food safety risk, the likelihood is you'll just get shot down. But now if you look at Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, you name it, everyone's got a point of view about food safety. So again, a changing culture, people are talking about it. But in the 1980s, essentially was the industry getting away with lots of things, the government turning a blind eye, and the culture of it was saying, well, it's all part of doing business, but it's a very different culture we have now. So in the 1980s, there was all these food safety scares. It's the industry that said, well, let's try something different. And what they went to is the HACCP. Now, HACCP's got an interesting history in terms of where it came from. People always suggested it came from the space program, but really it was way before then. Essentially the foundations for HACCP were set in World War II in ammunition factories where there was numerous accidents. And because when you trying to handle explosives and things go wrong, they go wrong in a big way. And so they said, well, to avoid these sort of accidents, why don't we develop a standard procedure, a standard way of doing it, so we can give it to somebody and they can follow this procedure and it'll be all safe. And that's the origins of SOP, Standard Operating Procedures, which was effective. So rather than just learning by mistakes, as you probably know, you can't make that many mistakes in ammunition factories, they actually had these written documentation. Now, after the war, these SOP principles were actually not split, but they went divergent in terms of evolution. One pathway was the International Standards Organization. So this is where we get standard procedures for manufacturing goods. So it doesn't matter if you're in North America, China, Asia, Brazil, anywhere. It gives you a standard you have to achieve. And we know from that ISO standard that we can be assured it's a good standard, a standard that's, regardless of where it's being produced, will be the same standard. And it does have a place in the food industry, ISO. It's, ISO 22000, for example, is a management system for implementing HACCP. And we'll be talking about ISO a bit later on. So ISO is a way of standardizing manufactured cars, for example. In the food industry, it's basically just a standardized food safety system. So if we have a HACCP system in China, It's equivalent to a HACCP system in North America. So those are sort of things. Now, another part of the SOPs was actually further developed in the nuclear industry. After the war, obviously the atomic bomb had been developed and radioactivity had been known for a few times. So people are going to look at nuclear industry as an inexhaustible supply of power. And the nuclear industry, when it first started, had a poor culture. Essentially, radioactive material would go missing. There was leaks. Nobody really knew what was happening. There was accidents galore. So they took the principle of SOPs and developed them a little bit further, because what they wanted to do is they wanted to recognize what could go wrong and then put in place things or implementations, technologies, procedures to prevent them going wrong. Because in the nuclear industry, a bit like the ammunitions industry, you don't get many chances. You can't learn from mistakes. So in the nuclear industry, they had this poor culture of nobody knowing what was going on and not accounting for this radioactive material and having accidents. So by having not only standard procedures, but identifying what could go wrong and then putting into place plans so they don't go wrong, it's the very early signs of a HACCP, isn't it? A hazard analysis, because the same procedure then was taken up by Pillsbury and the US Army to develop food safety production systems for food to feed the astronauts in the Apollo program. So HACCP's very similar to, isn't it? Because you identify the risks, you then identify the critical risks, then you implement procedures so you can monitor them, control them, and you can verify their effectiveness. And that's basically what HACCP is. So certainly HACCP was developed in the 60s, and in the 70s, when the space program got abandoned, I think, in 1973, there was attempts to put HACCP in place in the mainstream food industry, but the problem was nobody really knew about HACCP, apart from the select few that was working in the Pillsbury, and there was no real notion of risks in terms of a lot of risks weren't understood. And so what we had in these early HACCP systems is critical control points everywhere, which was unmanageable. Nobody knew how to manage it or implement it. And so it wasn't until the mid-1990s, about 1996, that rather than try just to push or drop HACCP on industry, they had a staged approach. So these stages were prerequisite programs, which looked at GMP, sanitation, good manufacturing practice. And then once you got those fine, then you could actually start implementing HACCP on that foundation. And then the next, very recently, you had to make sure that your HACCP plan was actually effective. Before, in the 1990s, early 2000s, all you needed to show was you have a HACCP plan, and that's good enough. But certainly in the mid-2000s, you actually verified that it's actually effective. So was it, but the important thing to note is this staged procedure, which what made it successful. You get the training and get the foundations in before you start developing to the next stage. And food safety culture is exactly the same. So the fact is then, as we said, with the good manufacturing practice, sanitation, HACCP, the ISO, GFSI, all these are food safety systems that no doubt have contributed to the standard, high standard we have today. But the reality is, with all these systems, is that despite all these efforts, we don't seem to be having such an impact on foodborne illness outbreaks. So in early 1999, there was the published sort of statistics on foodborne illness, and this estimated foodborne illness at 78 million cases in North America each year. Now, in 2009, they had a sort of re-evaluation of the statistics, and they said, well, it's gone down to 48 million. Now, some cynics say that it's because of the different way we report statistics, because with statistics you can say almost what you like. But since these sort of latest report of foodborne illness cases in 2009, which is 48 million, if you look at the statistics, there's nothing going down. Campylobacter is on the increase. E. coli is no change. Listeria, no change. Salmonella, no change. Vibrio, of 43%. So Vibrio is usually associated with seafoods, etc. And Yersinia, no change at that. So some people suggest that this lack of change is down to better surveillance. I think we test more, so we're going to find more. But I think the real point is that food safety systems alone cannot achieve maximum food safety. There's something else we have to add on top. So the reason why we still get outbreaks, the reason why we still get recalls, is really down to, as we talked about, food safety culture. And what I want to do now is just give you some examples of when food safety culture goes wrong. And the thing to remember about all these events I'm going to talk about is these are the flagship companies. These are the companies that really set the standard in the industry, and not the sort of small facility in the back street. So these are the major ones, and there's numerous examples I could give, but I'm going to focus just on these three because I think it illustrates how food safety systems aren't enough and the implication of food safety culture. So the ones I'll be going over is the Peanut Corporation of America incident. So the Peanut Corporation of America, that was one of the biggest recalls in US history, and we'll see how it really originated from poor sanitation in the plant, poor management, workers who were too frightened or didn't care about what was going on. Then I'll be talking about the Maple Leaf Foods incident in 2008 to do with listeria and deli meat, and the more recent one, which is XL Foods, which was in 2012. Again, all these things have things in common, which we'll see as we go along. So the Peanut Corporation of America then was the biggest peanut processor. So we all think about peanuts, and I guess most of us have peanuts in one form or another. Peanut paste is used in a wide variety of different products, and what the Peanut Corporation of America did is process those peanuts to make peanut paste, peanut butter, things like that. And they were implicated in a big outbreak, 691 cases, 9 deaths in 2008. But the other big impact was the recall because it was an ingredient. It was sent out to a lot of processors who put it into their product, and those products got sent out and obviously need to get recalled when the problems were alerted. Nearly 4,000 different product recalls, I'd say one of the biggest in US history. Now the thing is, when they actually did the subsequent investigation, they were finding a lot of big issues. The sanitation was poor. There was certainly testing for salmonella, and they were finding it, but the leader or the CEO of the company insisted that the product should be shipped because it was profit driven. And he had the attitude saying, well, we'll dodge a bullet, or he probably won't get found out. But he did get found out after 690 people suffered from it. So there was poor sanitation, and the worst thing is that the product was known to be contaminated, and it was sent out anyway. And there is going to be a federal case, court case to do this next year to see his fate. Obviously, the company went bankrupt overnight. But what's more interesting, relevant to this presentation, is the fact that when the incident happened, they did the interviewing with the workers, and there was one janitor there that talked about, it was so bad, the sanitation, there was mice everywhere, there were holes in the ceiling, there was sort of peanuts everywhere, the oil was everywhere. It was just a very poor place to be. And one could saying, well, that's fine saying it to the paper, but why didn't you raise alarms? Why didn't you go to the FDA to raise your alarm? And this is a big sort of issue about food safety culture, is that how much responsibility should be for the worker? Is the worker there just to take orders and say nothing? Or should they have this sort of empowerment that says they can flag it up, saying if they see something wrong, without losing their job, could they exist? Because a lot of the companies obviously live in a bully sort of era. If you made too many issues, you could get sacked for whatever reason, or your life could be made, shall we say, uncomfortable. And I suppose the other sort of part of the equation is that this is their lifeline. So regardless of what happens in the company, as long as they get the paycheck at the end of the week, they'll say nothing. And so it's a very complex thing about what's the responsibility of the workers, and we'll come back to this as we go along. Now, another big outbreak that occurred is in 2008, which was to do with the maple leaf outbreak of listeria associated with deli meat. So to cut a long story short, Maple Leaf Foods is the flagship of the Canadian food industry. These are the people who not only go by regulations, they actually go beyond the regulations. They have over 24,000 employed, and they've got all sorts of business, not just the meat industry, bakeries, all sorts. So this company was looked up to as the standard, what everyone should attain to. But uh, what happened was a major outbreak of listeria, causing over 24 deaths. Some people say 4,000 people were made ill. Certainly, the actual real number was much lower, but it's just estimation because not everyone suffers the same. And the thing about this listeria outbreak is that there were very big shortcomings from the company. So even though it was the sort of flagship company, there was sanitation issues. So, for example, they had, for the sake of throughput and product yield, they were having two shifts, and the sanitation shift after those two shifts had about a 4 hour turnaround in order to get the line clean for the next shift to come in. And there was a slicer there, the famous slicer, that hadn't been deep cleaned for 5 years. So rather than taking it apart, they basically superficially cleaned it. And as you can imagine, things got pretty nasty inside that machine because a listeria biofilm actually formed. And this basically contaminated all the deli meat slices. Now, the slicer was only just one aspect. They were finding listeria in the cold rooms, on doors, in drains. So it was pretty rife. It wasn't just down to this famous slicer. Now, the interesting thing is that you didn't need to test for listeria in those days. It might sound surprising now, but it wasn't an obligation to. But the thing was, they were doing environmental testing for listeria and were finding positives. But the thing is that they were finding intermittent positives. So they would get a positive, they would probably do something different to sanitation, for example, if they found it in a drain, they'll probably put some extra strong sanitizer down there. But what they weren't doing is trend analysis. They weren't linking up the test results. And so if they did, they actually started getting listeria positives a year before the outbreak. And if they actually started plotting the positives, they would have realized saying, yes, we've got an endemic problem on line 7, I think it was. But so they didn't do that. So they were basically getting a positive, changing something, or retesting, getting a negative, and saying, well, that's fine, it's done. So there's no trend analysis. But the other big thing was no communication with upper management, supposedly. So the story goes that the CEO of and upper management of Maple Leaf Foods weren't even aware of the listeria positive samples because the middle management didn't want to rock the boat. They wanted to maintain a status quo because it's human nature to want things to be predictable, to want things to be normal, to have predictable and normal sort of environment that so there's no surprises. And a lot of attitude came with Maple Leaf Foods, where the upper management weren't informed for the reason that the middle management didn't want to cause any issues. They wanted the upper management to think everything was going fine, so it protected their jobs. So there was no communication with the leadership, and also the workers, although they saw these positive results for listeria, they didn't make the CFA, the regulatory CFAA there, aware of the listeria results. They were not hiding them, that's not the wrong word, but they weren't telling them of a potential issue. Now, we expect the food inspector, the CFAA, to actually do something. We expect them to safeguard our food system. But the reality with the CFAA is that in the Maple Leaf incident, for example, they didn't even inspect the audit records and micro data. So the certainly data was there. The records were available after the event, and they saw listeria positives, but the CFAA didn't even inspect them. They just wanted, again, it's human nature to have a quiet life. As long as the product was going out, as long as it was going fine, they were fine with it as well. So they would turn a blind eye and not fulfil their regulatory duties. They even failed to impose regulations. So essentially, they were turning a blind eye to certain things, and because if they didn't see it or didn't report it, then everything looks fine. It looks like they're doing their job. They always talk about a limited number of inspectors, and this is another thing which we'll talk about with XL Foods, is the roles of unions and movements, because Like other workers, the CFA have a union, and they always constantly talk about, well, our inspectors are so stretched, they can't see everywhere, they can't do this, they can't do the job right, but give us more inspectors. But as we'll see, more inspectors will mean more things. And the other thing was about the limited power of inspectors to correct violations. So the fact is that the CFAA, if they wanted to do a recall or even close a plant down, they have to go up the chain of command. So the inspector on the floor talks to his regional manager, the regional manager then talks to his manager, and eventually gets up to the top of the CFAA, and they go to the Ministry of Agriculture. In those days, it was the Ministry of Agriculture to say, can we do a recall? It's a ministry that can issue the power. Now, the thing about the Ministry of Agriculture is that they're very pro-industry. They just want industry to succeed and grow and export, everything like that. And so what was happening is that the inspectors on the ground were saying, don't give me any issues because we know we won't be able to fulfill these we know that when it goes to the top, there'll be political implications. So the morale of the inspectors was very poor in terms of, I show people who've got violations, but nothing happens. So you can understand why they did turn a blind eye, because they say, well, if we don't see anything, we don't report anything, then it's all fine. So it was a very big issue with the CFA, and I think in a lot of ways it still is, even though their portfolio has now gone to the Ministry of Health. Now, the fact is that when the outbreak did happen, the government was all in array because they didn't know what to do. As I said, they're very balanced between promoting industry and obviously protecting the population. And so it was just like a wall of silence, and what sort of comments they did make weren't very good. But this gave a vacuum for Mike McCain to come through. Now, Mike McCain is the CEO, the big boss of Maple Leaf Foods. And they did a very good job of, should we say, crisis management. He came out, apologised, took full responsibility, and that's really what food safety culture is, because it's taking responsibility, one person being in charge, true leader. Now, people say, well, he was an innocent victim himself because he never got to know about the listeria beforehand, which I suspect he must know. I can't imagine a business running without him knowing that. But through one through another, he managed to save Maple Leaf Foods. Certainly, if that sort of outbreak had happened in the US, I would imagine the company would have been bankrupted into the Stone Age. It was sued into the Stone Age for sure. But essentially, what Maple Leaf Foods did is they put their sort of heart out there and just said, we did wrong and we're going to do better in the future. And certainly today, when you think about food safety culture and food safety in general, Maple Leaf Foods again is the flagship. They're the ones leading the way, and they talk a lot of food safety culture, which is true. They have certainly implemented a lot of different things. Now, after the Maple Leaf outbreak, people were suggesting that it could never happen again. There was a public inquiry that said we're going to make changes to the inspection, we're going to have more inspectors, so they can't say not under-resourced and things like that. But it didn't take long until another outbreak did occur. And this was in 2012 with XL Foods. So XL Foods are the largest beef processor, or the second largest in Canada. And the thing about this incident, it wasn't so much the number of cases. There were only 27 cases of E. coli, which it's okay to say only. I guess if you were suffering from one of those 27, you wouldn't say that. But a lot of those cases actually traced to Costco because they were doing tenderized steaks, and the tenderizing machine got contaminated, and that contaminated the steaks because when they'd been tenderized, it got put into the center, and people eat rare steaks and obviously got a dose of E. coli. But they did trace E. coli back to XL Foods in the end because of the poor sanitation. But the big thing about this sort of incident is there's two aspects. One, it was the biggest product recall because, a bit like the Peanut Corporation of America, the beef was used in different products. So it was sent out used in cooked products, raw products, you name it. And so they had to account for all those. And the other sort of big thing about it is this non-compliance. As we'll talk about, when it was inspected, And they found all sorts of issues: sanitation issues, food safety culture issues, lack of inspection issues, very similar to what was happening in Maple Leaf Foods to some degree. So after the incident, which went on all summer, or it feels like it went on all summer, over 2,500 products recalled. They said, let's do a review to see what actually happened. And they got three sort of vets and food safety experts involved. And essentially their sort of review looked at what was happening in the plant and also how well the CFA were performing. And how the system, i.e. the HACCP system and GFSI and things like that, were failing. It was a very expensive review. I think they got paid $3,500 a day, which is good for them. But it was I didn't think it went that far. I think it was a very government-friendly review, this one. But anyway, what were the key findings? Well, the key findings were that they had all the sort of paperwork in place in terms of a HACCP plan. But the problem is that they had the HACCP plan, but nobody followed it. It was basically just a set of documents in a room that nobody looked at except the auditor. They didn't have any recall plan. They actually used a paper system to look at suppliers and their customers. And so when the CFA said, well, where did you send this product on this day? They had a big delay of a week before they actually could trace it, the paperwork down to that, because they had to actually literally go through physical paper to find out where these products had gone. And when other issues came out, the CFA just went overboard and recalled everything. The management of XL Foods were essentially two ranchers, the Nielsen brothers. And the Nielsen brothers took over from Tyson Foods in 2009 when Tyson pulled out and went back to the US. But the Nielsen brothers weren't really into processing. They were essentially ranchers. They got paid, given benefits to try and take over the plant, which they did, but really didn't do any sort of management oversight. And when we had the XL Foods incidents, they were totally wall of silence. They didn't comment on anything, unlike Mike McCain did. The only time they did comment is to say sorry when they were actually taken over by JBS when it was a bit too late. So they detached themselves. They detached their ownership from the workers, and it was a pretty poor sort of food safety culture they had. So they had no leadership for a start, bullying. Certainly, it was aggressive management. People daren't talk for sure. The CFA inspectors, they weren't. They were turning blind eyes because they were just really, again, wanting a quiet life. They didn't want to make any waves, and therefore it was a failure on their part. Certainly, the communication. Joining us was poor. People were recalling products that didn't need to be recalled, and the Public Health Agency of Canada were fairly mute in their response, and they should be actually the leaders. But that's another matter. So the big thing about this incident is the fact that we have these food safety systems in place. XL Foods had to have a HACCP system because we're exporting across province and across to other nations. And really with HACCP, it is an evolving system. You get a HACCP plan, but you have to reevaluate it. You have to evaluate new risks. Is it? Have we got a new process in there? Will that cause a new risk? And then you make changes to that HACCP plan and then start again. So it's a continuous one. But the XL Foods, essentially what they had is a HACCP plan in 2009 when the Nielsen brothers took over, but it hadn't been reviewed since then. So it was a disaster waiting to happen. Worst of all is that they didn't have any monitoring verification records. In effect, they weren't monitoring their CCPs. So it was just a paper exercise. This HACCP plan was put into a nice binder, I guess, and it was just stood there for the auditor to look at, but nobody else looked at it, which is a big thing. So the XL Foods really illustrate, and it's not, you might think, well, that's just so unique. It's not unique. There's a lot of companies that are found to have HACCP, best laid plans, but don't actually implement them. And the other thing about the sort of XL Foods is, again, the workers. Like, how much responsibility did they have? So they had a strong union there, and they were talking, when they had a press conference, we were saying, look, we knew food safety systems standards weren't good. We told the management repeatedly about non-compliance. The plant was running too fast. And I had a kindred spirit with the union of the CFAA, because they were saying, oh well, if they had more inspectors, we could be looked at better. But it's very curious, isn't it? They were actually saying that they needed more inspectors to inspect their workers to make sure they were doing the job right. And this really comes again down to who was responsible. If they knew these issues were there, but they still went ahead and did them anyway, how much responsibility do they have? And we'll talk about responsibility and ownership as we go along. So when we had DXL Foods, when things started to die down, I did the interview with the workers. And they were coming out with statements like, well, we would never eat products from this place because we know what it's being done. We knew the knives weren't sterilised. The management didn't really care what was going on as long as the line was running, as long as we're getting productivity. They just turned a blind eye. They didn't care about hand washing. They didn't care about cross-contamination from low to high-risk areas. So again, it was a case of the workers looking at the management to say, well, if you tell us not to do it, we probably won't do it. But if you're just going to turn a blind eye, we'll keep going. And I guess to a certain degree, the inspection as well. They were looking at the inspector saying, well, if the inspector told me not to do it, then I won't do it. But they're turning a blind eye, so I'll keep on going. So it's almost like nobody's in control at all. They want somebody to tell them not to do something. So, these are just 3 outbreaks, but there's numerous other ones. And when you get these big outbreaks, there's knee-jerk reactions. One is let's have a new regulation, which is all right, have a new regulation as long as it can be enforced and as long as they're reasonable. People always call for increased testing. Well, you can't test your way out to food safety. Testing becomes very unreliable the lower the prevalence of your target is. So testing's good for verifying your safety systems in place, but it's not a very good safety net. If you're depending on testing to actually catch a contaminated product, you have to test a lot, which nobody does. Increase inspection, which is often called for, but does more inspection actually result in more safer food system? I don't think so, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. In very extreme cases, they say create a new agency. So in a way, I guess the changing of a portfolio of a CFAA to the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Agriculture can be considered that. But generation of a new independent agency has been called for in the US, but that's not really the key either. But a lot of the public inquiries that I do is saying, could the outbreak have been prevented? And more often than not, you say, yes, it could have been prevented if we'd been more proactive. And really, it is a case of ownership and responsibility. So in all these cases, and I'm pretty sure in most cases that of foodborne illness, when an error occurs, people know it's been a violation. The inspectors see the violations. The managers obviously should know what's going on. If they don't know what's going on, it's even worse. But the fact is, as I mentioned, there's nobody in control. Workers look to managers, workers look to inspectors, managers look to inspectors as well. And if nobody's saying don't do this, then we'll keep going. And the thing is, a bit like the union at XL Foods, if you say that I'm going to tell this other person about my concerns of food safety, in effect, what you're doing is you're transferring responsibility, aren't you? Because you say, look, I told you it was. It's not. I don't have to do anything then. I've told you, and it's your job to do something. And this is it. It's like passing the buck, isn't it, in terms of who owns the ship. And a key part of food safety culture is ownership. Everyone owns it. Everyone's got a part to play. And as I mentioned, the instant knee-jerk reaction after these outbreaks is more inspectors, more testing. But testing is unreliable, expensive. Inspectors certainly increase the detection, but not prevention. So the increase in recalls, for example, is because we do more inspection and more testing in a way. But it's not preventative. That's just trying to say we'll try and detect things when they go wrong. But the more better way is to actually prevent them. And more inspectors and more testing doesn't do that. It's essentially, it detects contamination when it occurs, but it does nothing to prevent it. So when we look at the cause of outbreaks then, we can see there's various causes. And One major one is improper holding temperature. We have inadequate cooking and things like sanitation, contaminated equipment. So I think you can see already all what these things got in common. It's got a human element to them. Human element in terms of temperature abuse, so refrigerated foods being held at room temperature for a certain period. Inadequate cooking, again, it can be down to processors, it can be down to the fact consumers, for example. There's a famous sort of outbreak of salmonella linked to pot pies where this producer literally guessed at a cooking time and temperature, and he put it on the label. And what was happening is people read labels saying, well, if it says this and for 10 minutes at whatever 400 degrees C, so be it, we'll do that. And essentially the pies were undercooked, and so what was happening? People consuming them anyway and getting salmonella. So inadequate cooking is down to various sort of things, say the consumer, but also down to process as well. Contaminated equipment, obviously sanitation issues, which is very big. Human error again, because we can sanitize sort of surfaces, but if they're not sanitized efficiently, you get cross-contamination, a bit like the maple leaf. Food from unsafe sources is significant because in today's market, it's globalized essentially. We get raw ingredients, products from all over the world. For example, fresh produce. You can't grow fresh produce in mid-December in Canada, I can tell you that. So we get it from places like Guatemala, Mexico, and we're relying on those countries to have the same food safety standards as we have. And sometimes it breaks down, and so we get food from unsafe sources, which can cause illness. Poor personal hygiene, lack of hand washing, but more significant in this category is the fact of ill workers coming into work, even though they're suffering from diarrhea, things like that. There was an interesting report just recently which says that 60% of workers admit to coming into work when they're being ill. Their motivation for that is because they don't want to lose pay, but the big risk to that is because they're going to transfer things like norovirus, salmonella, you name it, onto the product. So personal hygiene does encompass things like hand washing, but also coming into work ill. And again, it's a very difficult sort of challenge in terms of food safety culture, because if you turn workers away who are ill, they'll expect to be paid, and you'll get to this situation saying, well, you could do a sickie, so to speak, say you were ill and say, well, I'm ill, so I can't come in today and have a holiday. But it's a very difficult fine line to do, but we'll talk about that as we go along. So as I said, when you look at foodborne illness outbreaks, you can find root causes. It could be a new hazard. For example, who would have thought melamine in pet food would have been a hazard? So things like that, new pathogens emerging, new associations of pathogens with certain foods. So in the summer we had cyclospora in lettuce. I can see where the connection is, but it was one of the first times that had happened in terms of causing an outbreak. You might reformulate the product. So in the maple leaf case, for example, they were going for a low salt formulated ham, and they didn't appreciate salt's there to stop things growing. And so what was happening is that they didn't realize that this would increase the risk. Unsanitary equipment, Chamberlain Foods, for example, that they produced or processed melons. They had unsanitary surfaces of wood, no chlorine in the water, or very low levels of chlorine, and it was very open. There was nothing guarding against birds and all that. So the actual construction of the facility is also an issue, and the raw materials we talked about importing. For example, there was a big outbreak of norovirus implicating frozen strawberries from China that caused over 4,000 cases of illness in Germany. Because they didn't appreciate the raw material was contaminated. But more often than not, it's actually the individuals or groups of individuals who fail to follow safety procedures, i.e. humans are the weak link. And what food safety culture tries to do is realize, saying, well, why do people do what they do? Why do people knowingly do things that they know may cause illness? And we'll try and talk about that as we go along. So we talk about food safety culture, but as I said, it's not an easy thing. It's an easy term to say. It's a nice soundbite for if you want to have a quote, but what is it? And to know what food safety culture is, you have to know what culture is, I guess. And when you talk about culture, it is an invisible being. It's a collection of different things and not just one thing. You cannot measure it specifically. But when you think about it, as we talked about in the history, things develop into culture, and those cultures are based on knowledge, i.e., what do we knowledge do we have? Beliefs, obviously that's religion, the sort of art and law, the morals, customs, and all these capabilities of us in a society. So it's a lot of contributions. It's how we behave ourselves, what our beliefs are, and you have different cultures, and you can see the extremes like religious culture, for example. But that's not saying this culture is bad or good. It's a different culture, and this is a combination of things, historical. So in North America, for example, we've got a fairly short history in a lot of ways, and our culture is very different from that in Europe, which has a long, long history. So we develop different cultures, and if you compare, for example, the UK versus the US, it's very different. In the UK, we have obviously cricket rather than baseball. We have real ale compared to lager types. We like our fry-ups compared to our corn dogs, if anyone does eat those. And you can see all these things are linked to their culture. So cricket, for example, was developed centuries ago, and it was the countries full of aristocracy, barons, and this was the gentleman's game. Now, baseball was also developed in the UK, but it was a poor man's game. And essentially the working class were the people who came to North America, so it caught on much better than it would do cricket. That's just an example of how different cultures develop. And when we think about food safety cultures or even cultures to do with food, if you go to Asia, you see open live animal markets where you basically go and choose a chicken and they'll kill it in front of you and process it. Whereas in the West, we like our chickens at least packed and refrigerated, if not frozen. So again, there's different cultures. And these, you can't put one finger on it saying, well, this is why we do things in this country this way. It's just that they're very different, and it's developed over time. It's not an instant thing. It's developed over time, and it's traditional. So when we think about culture then, as I said, it really is down to a lot of different aspects. Social organisation, how people interact, the hierarchy, customs and traditions. So in North America, for example, Thanksgiving is a tradition in what makes America, America. Language, and we're not just talking about foreign languages, the way people talk and interact. Arts and literature are obvious ones. Religion is a big one. Government, you can only look at things like Nazi Germany to see how government can influence culture. So Germany was one of the sort of nice aristocracies, very similar to UK in a lot of ways, before Nazi Germany. But you saw how when the government of that time took over, they actually changed the culture to this sort of most evil axis, I guess the word is, history's ever seen. So government have an influence on the culture and shared values, and we'll talk about shared values a lot. Like what have we got values that we know that's right and we know what's wrong, and that's very critical in food safety. So okay then, we've got the definition of culture then, but can we take any of that nice woolly philosophy and put it into food safety culture? We can to a certain degree. So social organisation, a hierarchy of leadership and how people interact, customs and traditions. You'll notice that any food processing plant, they have their own way of doing things, and this has really come through traditional ways. People have developed systems, even though those systems might not be the safest. They say, well, we've been doing it this way for years, and we've never had an accident which we know of. So can be a barrier, it can be good. So traditions will dictate things. Basically, how do we handle foods? How do we prepare them? How do we store them? Language, again, not only just terms of foreign second languages, but what is the sort of language that's used within the, is it intimidation, is it supportive, is it antagonistic, things like that. I couldn't think of an arts and literature angle to food safety culture, and I guess religion to a degree, but not really down to food safety culture as such. But government, I put a question mark on, because governments can obviously change the culture, one by implementing regulation and inspection. Uh, Basically, if you've got a culture saying, well, we never used to check the temperature of our cooler, because that was we never traditionally did that, and then the government says, well, you should. Well, you're changing the culture then. But the government don't really want to be involved in culture changes. They all they're interested in is regulation and don't want to get involved in implementing food safety culture, which is a shame because they've got the greatest power to do so. So I always put government as a question mark, but shared values is definitely good. Do you share the same values as the management? Does the management share the same values as you? You know, does everyone know what's right and what's wrong? So in terms of defining a food safety culture, then people's tried to look at it. Chris Griffith on Cardiff University. You know, he really takes it out of the definition of culture from the from the origins of culture, and he's talking about, well, it's the aggregation of what's there already, our tradition, what we learned, what attributes do we share, do we know what the values are in terms of morality, I guess. And they talk a lot. He talks a lot in terms of, well, it's all these factors which affect our behaviour in terms of producing the same food. So you can see from his definition that it's all down to, well, it depends what was there before, it depends what's there now, what the people, how they interact, and what they believe is good or believe is right, and how they behave ultimately is defines what their food safety culture is. Now, Frank Yarnis, who used to be the food safety director at Disneyland, he came up with a different definition, which is kind of similar in some ways, but not in other ways. So he was saying that food safety culture is a way in which an organisation or group approaches food safety in thought and in behaviour as a component of a large organisation of culture. So he was a bit more direct in saying, well, yes, it's down to how the organisation is. Is it macho management, or is it soft management, or is it management that don't really care? And it's all down to how they behave. So it's not really taking all these separate components like Chris did. You know, what Frank's doing is saying, well, it depends what the entire culture is, because companies are more than just producing food sometimes, it's other sort of aspects as well. But the two key words there is behaviour. How do people behave? Now, when you go to a company and you say to them, have you got a food safety culture? They'll probably try and say yes because they want to look good. Others say, well, no, I don't think we have a food safety culture. But the reality is all companies have a food safety culture. Now, where the difference comes is that there's a good culture and a bad culture and all those things in between. So every company, every organisation has a certain culture associated with it. So when we think about a bad culture, these are the companies that don't really go with regulatory requirements. You know, XL Foods being their case in point. You know, regulations didn't affect them. A low perception of food safety, and this is very common because food safety really is down to driving a car and without a seatbelt, and I say most of the time you'll be fine. You'll drive, you won't be in an accident, you won't need the seatbelt, but that one occasion you do need the seatbelt, you're not there, you're going to be regretting it. And it's very much like food safety. So you go along, you do certain things, and you say, well, we've never had any outbreaks, never had any incidents, so we'll keep on going. But it's like a ticking clock, a bit like the XL Foods, a bit like the Peanut Corporation of America. You know, you can keep going on with things, but eventually you'll come across an incident, and that's where things go. But a lot of you can get very blasé about food safety and very relaxed by it. Just little consideration of consequences, and this is especially true for workers and the middle management, and even the upper management to a degree, because even the upper management, they knew if they were involved in a recall, yes, you might get sued in the Stone Age or just set up another business elsewhere. But what's happening now is that there is big consequences, because it's a federal offence. So essentially, if you're a CEO of a company, you're going to be, and you're involved in an outbreak that causes deaths, that's equivalent to murder, and you could go to jail for the rest of your life. So certainly things are changing, but certainly currently it all down to, well, what's the consequence? What could happen? There's no connection either to it. I don't see them doing a certain action and it caused an illness or paralysis or whatever in somebody who eats that. And there's no real enforcement by management. Management turn a blind eye to everything, so it's down to poor leadership. Now, when we go to the other side of the sort of coin, which Maple Leaf Foods have attained these days, uh, you make food safety a high priority, and things like companies like Maple Leaf Foods do that. They do extensive one, and if there's even a small doubt about the safety of a product, they just discard it, and that's cost them a lot of money in recent years. They comply with regulations and more likely go beyond the regulations. They go for GFSI, as I said, this is beyond the regulation. And they're committed management. So, essentially the management is committed, they enforce things, they've got to show true leadership and the compliance with the documentation system. So you can see a bad culture and a poor culture, and although like these are extremes, there are lots of people in the middle of that, and this is what we'll talk about. But at the end of the day, all things come down to money. Companies are in the business of making money regardless of what they are. And people go to work to make money as well. This is how the world works, isn't it? And the thing about food safety is that it can be expensive. As I said, Maple Leaf Foods, for example, these days, if there's even a hint of an issue, they'll just dispose of the product, and that product is many thousands of dollars worth. And the thing about food safety is invisible benefits is that it's not so much what it produces, it's what it prevents, isn't it? And you go along and say, well, there's no illnesses now, we're looking good, illnesses are coming down. We need to focus on food safety, and the reality is it does, because food safety, you can have one incident. I can give you an example of Jensen Farms, for example, in the US, in Colorado. They were farmers for 40 years. They had one lapse of judgment, and it caused a listeria outbreak. And they were literally bankrupt overnight, bankrupt into the Stone Age, and even they were looking at a prison sentence of some kind. But the fact is that like everything, if you think safety is expensive, then you try an accident, and it is true. If there is an incident, you can have a very long history. You can go back hundreds of years if you want. One incident these days kills a company. They get litigated into the Stone Age, as I said. The reputation gets tainted, and so the Peanut Corporation of America was, like say, the biggest peanut processor in the US. That basically dive down overnight because of the incident. And the Exxon, well, this is the shipwreck over in Italy, the cruise liner that ran aground, God knows how many billions that cost. But it just illustrates the point. One accident is one accident too many. You're only one accident away from bankruptcy. So the thing is how do you change behaviour then? We've agreed that culture is important. Food safety culture is down to the way people behave. Um, and the challenges is that companies are there to make money, and they'll focus on throughput and efficiency. That's much more critical. And even in not just food manufacturing, if we think about fast food outlets, when the heat's on, in terms of you in McDonald's and you got lineup, you might not take off your gloves, you might not change your gloves, things like that. You might not cook a certain burger as much as you wanted to. So this is a key thing. It's a challenge to behaviour, shifting it from sort of throughput and efficiency to sort of conservative safety. The motivation, how do you motivate staff to actually have food safety? They like doing a job, and then they come to do a job, they get told what to do, when to do it. But what can motivate them in terms of saying, well, this is wrong, you should sanitize that surface, or you should, if you get a positive sample, then you should reject it. That's the sort of food product batch. So motivation, how to get people involved in food safety culture is a challenge. Staff turnover. the lowest paid, hard work, you're bound to get a lot of staff turnover. And that can be a big thing because with cultures, we've probably seen is that it is down to longevity. It's having sort of traditions put in place. Those traditions only can really evolve if you've got people there for a certain amount of time. And so staff turnover is an issue. Low pay is, what's the motivation? Their education level. Certainly, when I was left school, I actually did work in a food service outlet, and we saw things happen there. Looking back on it, so I'll give you an example where they were bringing the ice cream out essentially and putting it not in a freezer cabinet. They were putting it in just a normal room temperature cabinet. And obviously, what happened is the ice cream melted over the sort of service period. Then it got put back in to get frozen again and brought out again. And this temperature abuse caused a salmonella incident. And looking back, I looked at that and said that doesn't look right. But it didn't. I didn't have the knowledge then, as I do now, that that is a dangerous practice. So education, language can be an issue. And even, like I said, food safety knowledge, like, do people really know about, for example, rice? If you leave rice overnight at room temperature, it's actually going to be very dangerous because of the growth of Bacillus cereus, things like that. But one would hope that they at least know rudimentary, but all these are sort of big sort of barriers to overcome. So as I mentioned, when you talked about food safety culture, people always talk about training. And a lot of people, that's what it is. They say, oh yeah, food safety culture, that's my people's got good knowledge about food safety. But it's not really, because food safety training varies in quality and quantity. You go to a lot of companies and they see food safety training as a nuisance. And there was one company, I won't tell you who it is, but they basically, what their food safety training is, just before you start at the plant, they'll give you a book saying, read this for half an hour, then go onto the shop floor. And so the quality and quantity, sometimes it is just a book. They might give you a DVD, very rarely, but sometimes they actually get you in a classroom to actually go through things with you. A lot of it's just training is just saying, do not leave foods at room temperature. But what they don't really go on to say is, well, why is it important? Why is temperature abuse such a critical issue? So you've got to explain how, not just how, but why as well. So need to provide context, and training, the trouble with it is that you read a book and you say, well, yes, temperature abuse is important, but if you don't give it context and you don't deliver it in a way that's interesting to them, the message gets lost. It just gets lost into because people aren't paying attention. And the key thing is you can have knowledge for sure. So we have knowledge, for example, that seat belts. If you don't wear a seat belt, you're involved in an accident, you're probably going to have serious injuries. But you see people without seat belts on and things like that. Smoking is a very good example where smoking ultimately leads to dangerous diseases, but people smoke anyway. So this is what I mean. Knowledge doesn't always equal behaviour, and this is a key thing. So when people talk about training, certainly it is important as an element for food safety culture, but it's not the same as food safety culture. It's just an element of it. Now, another sort of barrier you have to come across is people's bias, and people are complex, as we talked about. They've got as the humans, we're always going to be risk takers. If we weren't risk takers, we wouldn't do certain things. We wouldn't have got where we are today. There's always somebody has to take the risk to do something new, and that's how we evolve. That's how our civilizations evolve. But it can be a bad thing as well. So, for example, you get various attitudes, like the optimistic bias saying, well, I know it's dangerous to smoke, but it won't happen to me, so I'll just keep going. Illusion of control. And this is very apt with small processes where they said, well, we've been doing this for years, nothing's ever happened. I know how to do it, even though they might not be totally in control, which I can give you a few examples of that. Cognitive dissociation. This is where more serious, I guess, in one way, is that they know they're doing wrong, but there's always a reason for it. So, for example, if you're working in McDonald's and you've got a line of 10 people and you're supposed to change your gloves, or you're working in a sort of food service outlet where you're trying to get product out as soon as you can, so you might be undercooking it. See, I know I'm doing wrong, but I've got reasons to do that to increase my productivity. And ambivalence. Food safety is all right, but I've got to get this profit, and I've got to get this amount of product out. So all these attitudes are certain barriers which you have to come across or address in food safety culture. So the question is then, is how do you do it then? You've got to drive change, and the thing about change, and I'll repeatedly say this, is that you can't change things overnight. You can't just go into a plant and say, right, we're going to have a new culture now. Cultures evolve over time, and you have to drive this change fairly slowly, but you have to make a start somewhere. You have to start driving something. So one of the powerful messages is getting a link between actions and consequences. So in Europe, they had a very good video where they were basically showing food safety violations, and the next minute showing real cases of foodborne illness. And it was a powerful video because you could see the link between actions and consequences. And they actually banned the video in the end, but so it was a very powerful message. But the other thing about it is on the shop floor as well. If you went into a food plant and you didn't wash your hands, you've got to have a consequence to that. You can't just turn a blind eye. So extreme, you get fired, or at least warned or told why you should do it, something like that. Every action has a consequence. You've got to emphasize the social, medical, and financial costs. As I mentioned earlier, people don't make waves, workers don't, because they don't want the business to be tainted, because that's their sort of money source. But if you tell them, saying, well, if we don't have a good food safety culture, we could be involved in an outbreak, and we probably could be closed down. They can see that. They can link the plant closing to their sort of job going as well. So hopefully you can get a connection there. Certainly you've got to be very rigid. Don't accept any inappropriate behaviour. For example, you might feel that there's someone been there for 30 odd years and he comes in, didn't wash his hands. Say, well, I can't tell him that because he's been here for a time. No, you've got to have a zero tolerance to it. It's got to be very inflexible. You've got to alter the culture norms, and really this comes from the management. You've got to have a strong management, ideally a single person who sets the standards and expectations to the workers, saying we expect you to do this, and this is the standard we expect of you. And this tends to change behaviour after a time. And as we'll talk about examples of how to do that later on, but it's basically having very rigid sort of standards, expectations, and consequences to it. And when we talk about consequences, we don't mean just bad things like fired or warnings. Being positive, saying yes, you're going to get a badge or increase in money or something like that. Positive and negative. But as I said, the big thing is about the role of manager, because the managers are leaders. The workers do what they're told to most of the time. And you have to have strong leadership. And typically you want a single person as a recognised leader, like Mike McCain was. The reason why Maple Leaf got turned around is because they had one leader that could gather around. If you have a team of leaders, it can get a bit more confusing for them. And you've got to install confidence, a bit like a general has to. If soldiers don't think the general's up to it, they're not going to be up to it either. So you've got to install confidence, you've got to set an example. So when you walk into a food processing plant, you've got to go beyond even what you expect your workers to have. You've got protective gear on, you've got you're washing your hands, you're doing all sorts of things. And the other sort of thing is that it's not just down to management. You can't just train the managers in food safety culture and let it not filter down to the workers. Everything has to be involved. It has to be a well-tuned machine. So it's very important managers to understand food safety culture inside and out, but they've got to also instill it in the workers. They've got to train the trainers, and they've got to go and train the workers like that. So you've got to be very proactive as managers. You've got to, like I say, wash your hands and operate exactly what you expect your workers to operate at. And the other thing is you've got to take issues seriously. So even if somebody comes to you from the ground floor, so to speak, and they send an issue, you've got to listen to them. You might not do anything about it, but at least you listen to them and consider this and be very open about it. Now, discipline is the key. Everyone likes to work in a nice workplace which is fun, but if you're handling food and there's a food safety issue, you've got people's lives in your hands, and discipline is the key, as I mentioned. And it's not just a case of because when people think about food safety culture, I always think it's nice and woolly. You know, encourage workers, be nice to them, but in actual fact, a lot of food safety culture is discipline. We're used to stick. So I'll give you an example. In Maple Leaf Foods, for example, if you get one violation, for example, going from a low risk area to a high risk area with the same coat on, you get a warning. The second time you do anything like that, you get fired. And this is it, that's the stick. And you've got to be inflexible in that. It doesn't matter who it is. If they caught getting violated twice or three times, then you have to say, well, that's your lot. But after saying that, you also have to give praise. For example, somebody coming to you with an issue, or somebody doing something that they didn't need to do, but just to highlight a food safety issue. And you give praise in terms of promotion, pay, or whatever you feel like they deserve. But the thing is, you must have consequences. This is a key thing. You've got to be consistent. You can't say, oh, well, he's been working here 30 years, so I'm not going to do any discipline on him. But this one's only new, so I can really pile it up on him. No, you can't do that. You've got to have very consistent rules, and as I said, be very strict. You're not their friend, as I say, you're the manager. But the important thing is that it's all right being a manager which is both fair and fair, but you've got to also provide the tools as well for the people to actually have a good food safety culture. So even little things about putting soap in the hand wash basin, if people see hand wash basins that haven't got towels, haven't got soap, falling apart, they'll say, what does this tell me? That tells me a sign that these people aren't really interested in food safety at all. They're just and so you've got to be able to give a good facility, one that can be sanitized, wash stations, even equipment. Like if they need brushes, then give them brushes. And even a little thing like different coloured utensils, where they can say, oh, this is low risk area, this is high risk, we've got different colours. You know, that gives the workers an indication saying, oh yes, I can see they've actually thought about this. So you've got to provide tools to the workers to do the job. So that's fine then, but how do you implement a food safety culture? Not so much implement, I would say, but how do you change it to a good one from a bad one? Because all companies have a culture of some kind. And I think it's very much like HACCP. You need a staged approach. You need an approach that's not going to change everything overnight, but you've got to have the foundations there. And we think about big companies, certainly having prerequisite programs, and HACCP is a very firm foundation because you can build food safety culture on top of that. If you try and produce food safety culture at the bottom level, it's unlikely to happen because you have the facilities, you have the training, the knowledge, which you acquire through HACCP implementation. And it's a case of, yes, a staged approach, but also once you've done the stages, keep reviewing it, keep improving. So in a lot of ways, food safety culture then is a case of assessing what you have at the present time, what sort of culture do you have, then stepwise implementation in terms of how do we change things, what should we change. We don't want to change everything at the same time, we just want to focus on the most important things, and then we keep reviewing and implementing after that. So one of the big challenges is figuring out, saying, well, what food safety culture have we got? And you'll go into a company and you might have a guess at what food safety culture they have, but it's a very imprecise, a very subjective sort of area. And so what people are looking for is what we call a diagnostic tool. Is there a tool we can use to say what type of food safety culture has this company got? And this is a big emerging area. And as I say, it's, we're not quite there yet. And what people are starting to do is take ideas from the health and manufacturing industry and try and adapt them to assessing food safety culture. Because if you get a baseline, then you know what culture's in place and how to improve it. So there was a report just recently published by the Food Standards Agency that talks about a diagnostic tool, and you've got a link there if you want to actually go and see it. I'll go broadly through it now just to show you what the intricacies are. So, as I said, when we're looking at food safety systems, we're looking at things like microbiology, chemistry, and things like that. And in microbiology, for example, we can have indicator counts, pathogens. So you get a number, and we can say that number is good, i.e. it's in compliance, which is bad, it's out of compliance. We can check the pH and water activity of a product to see if it would support the growth of pathogens. Again, it's a number. It says yes, it does, or no, it doesn't. Time, temperature, again, a number. It does work or it doesn't work, but you can't use the same approach for food safety culture. There's no real pro for that. So what we use is a diagnostic tool. And these diagnostic tools, as I said, there's nothing specific for food safety culture. It's what we have to develop. And we've taken things from the healthcare, which obviously is significant, and manufacturing industry, and try to amalgamate those into this sort of diagnostic tool. So it's based on those, but obviously they aren't to do with food at all. They're something totally different. But the thing is about these tools is that you would think, well, let's do a questionnaire to the workers. But really, that's just an element of these diagnostic tools, because people tend to say what you want to hear. And so you don't have extensive employee questions, but obviously you do talk to them. You need to get some sort of feedback, but it's not the primary goal of this diagnostic tool. One of the big challenges is the scale of industry. So you get very small, where you might have one owner, maybe 2 or 3 workers, to sort of Maple Leaf size, which is 24,000 workers. Yeah, how do you adapt it? And likelihood is that you have to adapt a diagnostic tool to each of those sort of scales of economy. But it is a challenge. In actual fact, you avoid culture-based questions, because really you're only interested in what goes on in the food product itself. You're not really interested in what happens outside the food plant in the personal life. So you try to avoid about, where do you come from, what country do you come from, things like that. You've got to be specific to food safety and concepts, because that's more important things. And what you've got to do is, through all of these tools, the big result is you get an assessment, but more importantly, you get ways to improve the food safety culture. You can see exactly which points you need to improve. So what we do is we'll break down the sort of food safety culture in its different elements, and then we can assess which each of those elements portray. So there's 8 elements in total. We've got priorities and attitudes, as in, is it profit driven? What's their attitude to food safety? Their sort of risk of perception, like, do they know the risk and how do they perceive it and how do they apply that? The third category is how confident are they in their food hygiene practices? Do they think they're doing a good job, or do they think they could do better? Ownership of food hygiene, which is very important. This is what I was talking about before. Who's responsible for it? Like, have they got one person? Is it several people? But who's running the shop there? Is it competence? Like, are the people trained to do certain things? Are they trained to know about food safety and things like that? The leadership, which we talked about, how important is that in food hygiene? How do employees actually engaged in the process? Like, do they appreciate that food safety is important, and how do they contribute to the food safety culture of the actual establishment? And what's the communications like? Can a worker come up to a manager and say this is wrong, or is it a bit more less conservative? So these are the questions actually in the diagnostic tool. I won't go through all of them, but I'll just try and give a summary what each one refers to. So priorities and attitudes. So really what this is talking about is saying, well, what's the motivation here? Is your priority is to get profit, and to what extent does food safety figure in those priorities? Again, it's an open question. This is what you ask the management, and a lot of time they'll say, oh yes, it's very important, but we'll talk about how we can address that later. Food hygiene, risk perceptions and knowledge. So basically what you're talking about here is how do they perceive risk? Now, because there's 2 sort of extremes, isn't there? There's people who don't see the risk, vis-a-vis, people reducing salt or taking out nitrite, saying, well, we don't really need those. They don't see the risk of botulism and things like that. And you get to the other extremes saying, well, yeah, I know botulism might occur, but what's the chance of it? So you get 2 extremes, one that don't know about the risk and others do. So these sort of questions bring it out in terms of You know, what is their risk perception of certain issues? The confidence in food hygiene and safety requirements. So really what this is saying, well, if you do a certain practice, is to be leave your product out at room temperature, do you think this is going to give you an issue down the road? You know, some might say no, some might say yes, and some might say I don't know. But again, it gives you that indication about where they're failing or where they're succeeding in a food safety culture. So business ownership, as I say, ownership is one of those sort of aspects, and a good way of addressing these questions is give examples, because people can often say to you, say, well, have you got a good food safety culture? And say, oh yes, we have. But if you say, well, give me examples why you think that is, yeah, they might be suffering then from trying to get to an idea. So anything with providing examples is always good. And so essentially what these questions are is about responsibility, ownership, like who decides about food safety. And you might think it's unusual questions to ask, but if you go to a company and ask these questions, more often than not, they'll say, well, it's the quality control manager. And the quality control manager says, well, no, I just make sure things are in compliance. I don't actually do anything in terms of promoting food safety. So certainly it gives you an idea who's running the ship. Competence and knowledge. So this is down to training. As we said, it can be a lot of different quality and quantity of training. So who does the training? Are those trainers qualified? How long does the training last? So this tells you a lot about their current knowledge. Leadership, like who does the encouragement for food hygiene and sanitation? You know, is it the managers? Is it anybody? So everyone needs encouraging. Everyone needs to be setting examples. So this set of questions does that. You know, what do you do as a manager to set a good example? And you know, they might be struggling to find examples for that. Employee engagement review, like who actually reviews these food safety systems? Like, does anyone consciously go out there and decide what to do about certain violations? Is somebody who goes out there saying, well, we've had an incident, let's revise things? And again, you might find it surprising when you do go into a real industry. You'll say, well, we thought somebody else was looking after that, and in reality, nobody's looking after that. If you think about Excel Foods, exactly that. Who was responsible for this sort of thing? Not many people, obviously. Communication, like this is a big thing. Now, how do you communicate? Do you just basically put leaflets on the floor? Do you actually talk to your staff and ask them what about food safety issues? And what is the mechanism of reporting? Like, is it in confidence? Is it we have to go to our supervisor and tell them? And so anything like this is important because this gets to the heart of a culture. Like, is the persecution for people who whistleblow, or is it encouraged? And again, when you go to commercial places, you'll be amazed what you'll find in terms of nobody wants to put their head up because they know they're going to get shut off. So the questionnaire is one aspect, but you can't just use a questionnaire because people can give the answers you want to hear. You've heard the claims, but you've got to see if they walk the walk, and you do that by document review. So you'll go to the HACCP plan, but you won't just see the HACCP plan and say, oh yeah, that's good. You'll look at the records and the deviations and things like that, because if there's no deviations, i.e. they never needed to correct anything, you'll start questioning that, saying, well, it can't run perfectly all the time. So in actual fact, the more sort of deviations you have is an encouraging sign, because they can say they've recorded it and they've done something about it. They seem to be proactive, but if you've seen no deviations or anything like that, that might tell you, saying, well, no, maybe there is more to this than meets the eye in terms of them not documenting them. And the training records, to say, yes, these people have been trained to this degree and it's been reviewed at certain ones. So documentation review is important, but again, not alone. And this is the important one, is observation. So actually going into the facility itself and seeing the everyday thing. Now, the thing to watch out for is if you go with a clipboard, you know, people's attitudes change. You know, they'll do the right thing, but once you've gone, they'll go back to a certain baseline. And you know, people's talked about putting cameras in and things like that, but you certainly get much more, especially if you're embedded and they just ignore you after a bit. You get a lot of information by observation, because you'll see all those things that are said in the questionnaire if you actually put them into practice. But as I say, you've got to play it fairly cool in terms of people are conscious when you actually get people observing your performance. So once we've done all the questioning, we have to start categorizing people or companies, isn't it? Because if you don't categorize, you can't tell how to improve things. So the way you categorize things is you've got different sort of classes. You've got amoral calculators to leaders. So at extreme things is that the amoral calculators basically know they're doing wrong. They'll do it anyway, and they'll just do it for financial gain. And then you get the leaders who are very proactive. Not only have they got a good food safety system, they've got a good management system, and they're just evolving. And you get a lot of in between. So the one between the dependents is they're the ones who say, well, you inspector, you tell me what I'm doing wrong and I'll do it right. Or the manager says, you tell me what I'm doing wrong and I'll do it right. Things like that. So the dependents are the ones that ask for advice. Doubters accept the risk. Well, they accept that there is a risk, but they don't really do anything about it. So had no problem before, so let's not do anything else. Then you've got proactive compilers who really are work in progress. These are the people who understand the risk and enforcement, they encourage ownership and responsibility, but they quite aren't there yet. So as you can imagine, the proactive compilers and leaders is where you want to be. The doubters, dependents, and moral calculators, the ones where you don't want to be. But you got to, by using these metrics about the questionnaire, observation, and documentation, you can categorize them into different ones. And this is just an example of one. So this is your moral calculator. So you've got the 8 sort of categories here, and these 8 categories, they can obviously people can be one category and a moral calculator, but another category a doubter. You have to accept that, but it gives you an idea about, well, we've done our sort of things that we consider food safety as a nuisance, for example, or we don't trust or discourage reporting concerns, as in Excel Foods, I guess. So this is one side, but what it does, because you categorized it, you can say which area you need to improve upon. And this is the other side of it. This is the leaders, a bit like the Maple Leaf Foods then. They consider high priority. They let employees feel free to completely report and with no consequence to themselves. And so by using this sort of matrix, then you can categorize into different elements. And as I mentioned, with these different elements, you can actually then promote things. You can tell them where they have to evolve and where they have to go. So in terms of asking for improvement, then obviously a moral calculator, you have to highlight the consequences, i.e. you're going to go to jail, for example, or you're going to cause this illness. And you've got to get milestones and small steps, because as I keep saying, you're not going to change culture overnight. It is literally takes you step by step, and these are small steps rather than giant leaps. So you could take to a moral calculator saying, look, I want you to be a leader within about a week. You can't do that. You have to tell them, get the sort of high risk non-compliances, and then how to get milestones to achieve that. Obviously you can close them down as well, that's another aspect, but dependence, really what you're going to do is try and develop things for them, trying to get them to be less dependent on you telling them to do things and more independent. Doubters, well, you say these know about regulations, but explain how a regulation, for example, you are not allowed to store food in temperature abuse condition more than 2 hours, room temperature for 2 hours if it's high risk. Tell them why that's important, try and get a connection there. And with the other two, you basically just try and encourage them, saying, for example, leaders, you've got to say go for awards, because the thing about food safety culture, a bit like HACCP, once you stop evolving it, once you stop reviewing it, if you think you've come to the end of the road, that's the most dangerous time, because that's the time you feel very complacent. So you've got to always strive, even if you're a leader, you have to keep striving to get better and better. So the thing about diagnostic tools, as I said, it's a very emerging area, and it is difficult because for one, it doesn't work for all scales of business. As say, you've got small businesses, large ones in between. So you might have to adapt it basically, but on that. You could do it internally, but when you think about looking inside a company, it's always better to have someone from the outside looking inside. and it must be reliable and objective. You know, you could have an internal one and they could say, oh yes, we've got such a good food safety culture, but you'd be saying, well, is that reliable and objective? So that's why it's limited internally. It's good to get an external, but when we talk about external people coming in to look at food safety culture, we say, well, who could it be? Could it be a government inspector? As I mentioned, government inspectors will be well placed for this because they can see things from day to day and have a good assessment of what should be going on, what shouldn't be. But you go to governments and they'll say, no, it's not our job. Our job is to do regulations, because with food safety culture, you go beyond the regulations in a lot of ways, and you can't government can't be seen there saying, well, we've got regulations, but we expect you to go more than these regulations, because you can't change the rules like that. So government tried to steer away from food safety culture in terms of assessing. Then you've got the third party auditor. So third party auditors have come under a lot of focus recently, because in all those outbreaks I've told you about, they had an audit before the outbreak and everything was good, you know, because auditors essentially get paid by the people who are auditing, and it can be lack of training. It can be sort of concern about how reliable they are, and also the trouble with third-party auditors is that they look, even though with GFSI the switch now, rather than being paid by the processor, they're actually employed by the retailer. There's always a concern about negative standing, because as I'll talk about in a bit, people think of audits as being under a microscope, as in they're going to find out bad things. In actual fact, auditors can actually be very positive. They can highlight areas where there could be improvements. But there's always a concern about negative ratings, because negative ratings mean the Walmarts of the world won't buy from you, which means you're in a big issue. And impartiality, as I said, you can have impartiality in terms of, if you're employed by the retailer to look at a processor, you might say, well, I'm going to be really hard on this one because I want to make the retailer look like I'm doing something. And you can get the other sort of side where you're paid by the processor. You've got to say, well, I've got to keep them sweet because I won't be auditing this place again if I take a bad report. So there's two things on that one. But as I say, with third-party auditors, impartiality is very questionable. Excel Foods, Jensen Farms, Maple Leaf, all these had high scores before the outbreaks, only to find that they were totally unreliable. So getting a food safety culture audit by a third auditor, you know, people question that. Because the thing with auditing, as I said, it's a bit like getting ready for a night out. You build up to it, you'll probably get your good dress, put your good makeup on, and once you've had the night out, you go back to a normal sort of status. And I always say this is what auditing's like, because auditors have to make appointments and everything gets ramped up for auditing day. You know, things get done, and once the audit's over, they come down to a sort of base level. And really, that's not, you want to see the everyday operation, really, in order to assess how well a thing's doing. And although auditors are potentially good for food safety culture audits, as we said, they have to be viewed with caution. Now, GFSI is a recent innovation, retailer-based, and GFSI really was down to giving higher standards, equal standards across the industry. And as a positive point for industry is to have a same standard. So one audit rather than several audits. And that one audit would be used to say this is good or bad on a global scale. And GFSI in a lot of ways is a good platform to look at food safety culture, to go in there and see what is their food safety culture. But they've gone away from that. There was an interesting Global Food Safety Conference which was based on GFSI, you know, benefits of it and all that. And if you read the sort of book, well, it was the summary of the meeting that came out of that, each one of the speakers who came up said the importance of food safety culture. But the interesting thing is that there was no mention of how it would be implemented. It was just sound bites. And you know, the net result is GFSI isn't really there to look at faults. They're not there to be consultants. They're not to hold your hand and take you up to the sort of echelons of food safety. They just tell you how bad you are and if Walmart will buy from you almost. But really, auditing should be a bit different. Auditing should be encouraging them in terms of identifying where they can improve and being nurtured along. And in some ways, you could think that auditing food safety culture should be totally separate from things like GFSI, but issues are there. So as I mentioned, really it's down to improved performance, and usually you have to have someone from the outside coming in to diagnose the problem. Once you've diagnosed the problem, you can make improvements, you can implement them, and see if it's made a difference. So this is what food safety culture is, a bit like HACCP, continuously evolving. So in terms of developing a culture or changing a culture, I suppose is a better term, is that you have to start somewhere, and you have to take small steps. Literally, you can't make very big leaps very quickly. But if you start and you start looking at the big risks, the big factors, and sort those out, you can start prioritizing how to deal with the other ones. You've got to know your staff. So I'm not saying you have a party and get to know each one personally, but you've got to understand what motivates each individual. Are they a leader? Are they a follower? Are they indifferent? So you've got to know your staff like that. Your management team have to have a deep understanding. These are the leaders, and if your leaders don't understand food safety culture, then how are you going to let the workers do? Be assertive and limit flexibility. There's a famous thing, isn't there, where you say, "I'm not your friend, I'm your father," sort of thing. And it's very similar to this in that you don't need to be the friends. You don't have to socialise with them, but you've got to be assertive, be inflexible, and everyone's got to pull the same line. You can't have what production managers saying, "Oh, it doesn't matter about the temperatures being incorrect on this fridge," whereas a quality manager saying it does matter. If you get this sort of conflict, people work on those conflicts to undermine the culture. So in terms of techniques then, there is several techniques you can use. One is to identify influential people within the workforce. So these can be team leaders, long-term employees. It doesn't necessarily have to be managers. It needs to be those who are natural leaders. Union reps, I guess, is a good example. Because these are the ones that you have to convince the rest of the people to conform because the other sort of aspect, if you get a workforce that's been there for a few years and they're entrenched in the ways, you might have to make some big decisions saying, look, if you don't go by these new rules, then you'll have to go somewhere else. And it might sound easy, but if you think about somebody who worked there for years and years, you suddenly say, well, no, we're going to let you go. But these are the decisions you have to make. Certainly you've got to really motivate them. You've got to make them aware that the central role of success is down to them. It's also good to get the managers experienced in what happens on the shop floor. So, for example, get managers to go on the front line answering customer complaints, get them to do sanitation. There's a program on TV about going back to the shop floor where these senior managers went onto the shop floor, became the normal workers, and at the end of each program, they used to say, yeah, wow, I didn't know that happened, and they actually made changes. And this is what you have to do. You literally have to get off your sort of ivory tower and come down to the floor to see how you do it. But the thing about it is that you've got to make changes, but not micromanage. So it takes a long time to get a culture, but you've got to start somewhere. But you don't look at every single infringement and punishable by sacking. A good example is about meetings, for example. So if you're trying to change the culture of a company, it's good to start with these little things about, well, we're going to have a meeting, we're going to be very inflexible on time, we're going to start at a certain hour, finish at a certain hour. We expect you to be there. If you're not there, we're going to start without you anyway, and you've got to catch up somewhere else. Little things like that is important in terms of giving some sort of structure, rigid structure, and consequences after that. But certainly don't micromanage things to the nth degree, because the more things you try to change globally, the less chance you've got succeeding. You've got to prioritize certain things. Big thing is empower workers. So workers feel like they get told what to do rather than have power to make change. And you've got to let them have change. You've got to let them have a voice. You've got to let them be involved in monitoring, reviewing, things like that. Any worker should be able to remind another not to follow food safety practice. So, for example, if you've got to work on the line and the CEO comes in, that worker should be able to tell the CEO, do this and do that. In actual fact, Mike McCain had this. He went to visit one of his plants, and one of the packing workers who was working on the packing line, told him to wear a pair of gloves. And traditionally, you would think, God, you don't tell the CEO that, but essentially, that's what you need to do. You have to have a hierarchy for sure, but when it comes to food safety, that hierarchy tends to dissolve a bit. Ensure who knows responsibility and expectations. That's very important. You can't have an excuse saying, well, I didn't know I was expected to do that. You've got to be very rigid in terms of who's responsible for what and what you expect from people, because then you can tell them if you go out these sort of limits, and you're not going to be in compliance and therefore might have to do something. Communication. It's got to be positive, to consider all ideas. So even the worst ideas, you've got to listen and consider them and discuss them. Anything negative tends to make people go back into a shell, which basically not good for your culture at all. Reinforcement by simple symbols. Certainly symbols alone don't do the job, because people just ignore them after a time, but reinforcement is a very good tool because they can see the symbols, very simple, and it gives that reinforcement. But not some companies just use signals and saying, well, these are the signs, just look at them, you'll be fine. No, they're only useful if they're reinforcing a message, not just delivering a message. So FSMA is the Food Safety Modernization Act in the US, and we've got our own Modernization Act here in Canada. Very similar. I wouldn't be surprised if they're almost carbon copies. But in FSMA, what they've done is they've got an act there, but they haven't got regulations to pile into it yet. But what they're proposing is that every company requires training and supporting document for that training. But more importantly, they have to approve, the FDA have to approve a curriculum. And really, I think this is really missing the point, because as we said repeatedly, training alone doesn't change behaviour. And this is a weakness of the FSMA system, because government are very reluctant to get into the sort of whole idea of food safety culture. They want it there, but they don't want to be involved in applying it or assessing it. So with FSMA then, and like I say, probably the Modernisation Act here in Canada, they talk about approved curriculums, but in reality, they're just basically taking the old line saying, if they're trained, they must be good. Doesn't work like that. So food safety culture on the farm is another sort of important issue. Certainly farms are distant from the consumer, and it's not sterile, so it's and usually a small number of personnel. So it can be difficult, but as I say, if you just focus on those main points, like manure management, water quality, biodefence, all these sort of points there will, if you can instill those into them, you can change the culture on the farm. Don't try to do everything at once. Don't say, well, you've got to do this, and we're here, let's make sure this is going to be working well. You can do it, but it has to be focused. And when we come to the other side of the spectrum, the food service and retail. Now, food service and retail are very strange sort of environments. The retailers, for example, say we don't produce any food at all, we just distribute it. It's nothing to do with us. And food safety in food service outlets are compromised, again, through the fact of this belligerent behaviour in terms of it doesn't really matter what I do, it's not going to do any consequence. And you don't realise it's a food product. You feel, well, as long as I'm sending this stuff out as quick as I can, all's going well. You've got no notion of safety. And there was an interesting sort of situation earlier this year where this Taco Bell worker was posted this picture up, and you can get compromises, because, as I say, at retail they don't consider themselves as processors or responsible for food safety, and in food service outlets you get the young, which are naturally rebellious, and obviously they're the ones that take risks. And when you're looking at young workers, there is a way of enhancing the food safety culture. Now, the good news is they're usually straight out of school, so they're used to following the rules. So if you set the rules, and as I say, you've got to keep messages simple and focused. You can't have sort of 10 things at once. 3 or 4 things is sufficient. So with young workers, you can install culture, but you've got to get it right first time. You can't expect them to change halfway through. So in terms of future trends then, food safety culture is still a concept in my mind. Really, the way to do it though is to implement it stepwise. You've got to set a foundation, you've got to know what food safety culture is, you've got to implement it, and you've got to show that it's been proven. very much like a hazard-based system. So in terms of future trends, I think we are entering a sort of age of food safety, and certainly the only way we're going to do it is learn from the hazard experience. It still is a concept, it still is a soundbite. So in conclusion, I think what I've hoped to show you is that food safety systems have been effective at reducing foodborne numbers, which they have for sure. But we've come to a plateau now, and I think the next stage is trying to work on the human element in terms of trying to change the food safety culture. And this is going to be a challenge because science is easy, changing people's behaviours is hard. So it is a simple concept, and what we need to is get better tools in order to diagnose what the culture is and reinforce the fact of leadership being essential. But the other thing is about auditors and who can monitor behaviour. Auditors, the third-party auditors, could play a role. Government could play a role, but they have to be involved. And the thing about changing culture is that it is a slow process. It is difficult, but it is achievable. Because if we think about smoking, for example, in the 80s, you could smoke on planes, theatres, you name it. But it's interesting, even this modern day, they're talking about banning smoking in Toronto in public places. So not only can smoke inside, you can't smoke outside either. So it does come with change, but as I say, it's a very slow process, and it's a stepwise process, but you can get there in the end.